Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to bring you my favorite Victorian novel, which is also one of my favorite books of all time in general, and that book is Villette by Charlotte Brontë. I read this book for the first time a couple of years ago, so I'm not going to do a traditional review of it. Rather, I wanted to give you my top 10 reasons why I think everyone should read Villette. Number 1. George Eliot said so. When Villette was first published in 1853, George Eliot said, quote, "Villette, Villette, have you read it? It is still more wonderful than Jane Eyre," which is a controversial opinion. I think Villette is a far more interesting and complex work, even if it's maybe a less perfect and neatly tied up novel than Jane Eyre. Reason number 2 is that it is very autobiographical. This book was based largely on Charlotte Bronte's experiences as a teacher in Brussels, and a lot of the characters in this book are based on real people. Charlotte also wrote this book after the untimely deaths of her brother Branwell and her sisters Emily and Anne, so a lot of the darkness and depression in this book would seem to reflect the sadness and the grief that Charlotte felt at the loss of her beloved siblings. Reason number 3, Lucy Snowe, our narrator, doesn't give a fuck. This novel is narrated by Lucy Snowe, who is perhaps one of the most unreliable narrators in literature. This book follows her journey from England to the city of Villette, which is based on Brussels, and that is where she starts teaching at a Catholic school for girls. Her past is almost entirely obscure to the reader. There are some vague references to a great tragedy in her past, and she seems to be entirely alone in the world, but we're not privy to anything more explicit than that. And there are several instances in the book of her withholding information from the reader, particularly when it comes to a character called Dr. John, and there are even some smaller moments like her receiving a bunch of flowers from someone and then not telling us who they're from until a few hundred pages later. And I often hear Lucy described as being hostile to the reader or being angry at the reader, and I wouldn't characterize her in that way myself. She's withholding in the way that a lot of people in life are withholding. Most people are inherently unknowable to the people who surround them, and Lucy Snowe is exactly that to the reader. You know some things about her, but you don't know everything about her, and that maybe makes her unreliable, but it also makes her unreliable in an incredibly human way. This is a book very much told from the perspective of someone who exists at the periphery and at the margin of things, someone who is an observer rather than a person at the center of attention. So much so that Lucy Snowe spends the first 36 pages of this book observing and narrating the lives of people who end up being secondary characters in this book. And I think that's a reflection of the way that she assumes she's a secondary or side character in other people's lives, and that she's not worthy of a story of her own. And that's what makes this book so rich and so complex, and what makes her such a fascinating narrator. Reason number 4, the unrequited love in this book will break your heart. I don't know if it's because I read this book as a young person, but I found the depiction of unrequited love in this book to be one of the most poignant and resonant that I have ever encountered. You can see that Lucy Snowe never expects her admiration to really amount to anything, and never expects that her love is going to be reciprocated. And Lucy is sensible and rational about all of it, but that doesn't stop her from sometimes admitting the intensity of the feelings that she has. For example, when she loses some of the letters that she receives from this guy, she says, "He asked me, smiling, why I cared for his letter so very much. I thought, but did not say, that I prized it like the blood in my veins. I only answered that I had so few letters to care for." And what's especially powerful about Lucy's unrequited love is that the object of that love is not entirely undeserving of it. I feel like so much in books, that character, that admired person, will turn into a jerk in order for the protagonist to kind of come to their senses and then end up with the person they're supposed to be with. But that's not the case in Villette. Here's what she says. "I have been told since that he was not nearly so perfect as I thought him, that his actual character lacked the depth, height, compass, and endurance it possessed in my creed. I don't know. He was as good to me as the well is to a parched wayfarer, as the sun to the shivering jailbird. I remember him heroic. Heroic at this moment I hold him to be. It's a matter of Lucy forming a really strong and powerful attachment to the first man in her life who has ever shown her any sort of admiration or regard or affection. Reason number 5 is that there are 2 love interests in this book, and not in a Mr. Rochester St. John kind of way. Instead, Lucy legitimately is into 2 very different guys in this book. And what's extra interesting is that both of these guys were based on real men that Charlotte Brontë knew and had affection for, and you can read more about that in Claire Harmon's biography, Charlotte Brontë, A Fiery Heart, if you want to know some of the details and read some of Charlotte Bronte's pretty intense letters. Reason number 6, this book offers a really interesting look at 19th century depression and mental health. While reading this book, it becomes to the modern reader kind of painfully apparent that Lucy Snowe is suffering from some sort of depression or mental health issue in this book. And even though Charlotte Brontë may not have utilized the kind of terminology that we're now used to describe depression and mental health, I think what Lucy goes through is pretty recognizable, and a lot of what she experiences still rings true today, especially when she's talking to Dr. John, and he's a person who kind of the sun seemingly shines down on all the time, and at one point he tells her that she needs to cultivate cheerfulness and happiness. So she says, "No mockery in this world ever sounds to me so hollow as that of being told to cultivate happiness. What does such advice mean? Happiness is not a potato to be planted in mold and tilled with manure. Happiness is a glory shining far down upon us out of heaven. She is a divine dew which the soul, on certain of its summer mornings, feels dropping upon it from the amaranth bloom and golden fruitage of paradise." Reason number 7, Lucy takes opium and meets a sphinx. So there's a really crazy scene towards the end of the book where Lucy isn't feeling well and she's given this draught or something that turns out to contain opium, and then she kind of goes to this festival fair that's happening, totally drugged out and tripping, and sees a sphinx, and it's super trippy and disorienting and a completely bonkers scene. And apparently Elizabeth Gaskell asked Charlotte Brontë after the fact how she could write about tripping on opium so realistically, and Charlotte Brontë apparently told her that she thought about it intently for many, many nights and then woke up and knew how to write about it. She just used her imagination. So okay, Charlotte. Reason number 8, Charlotte Brontë is a very smug Protestant. There's a wild section at the end of the book where someone tries to get Lucy Snowe into Catholicism, and it basically turns into her being super smug about being Protestant and thinking that Catholic people are weird and superstitious, and her just having all of these anti-Catholic rants. It kind of reveals Charlotte Bronte's conservative view of Catholicism and sort of continental people in general. There's like a big thunderstorm and she's teaching at this Catholic school, and says, "The Catholics were thrown into a panic by a bit of a hurricane and clutched their inert icons to their fervent chests. I, the sole Protestant, the beacon of individualism, I chose to live." So it's like, okay, Charlotte, like, get down off your high horse. Religious intolerance is not okay, but this is a pretty interesting insight to Charlotte Bronte's thoughts on denominational Christianity. Reason number 9, there is an ambiguous ending that will make you go back to earlier parts of the book and find pieces of foreshadowing that you didn't even know were there. No spoilers, but when you get to the end of the book, I advise that you go back to the beginning of chapter 4, and that maybe may point you to some clues about what actually happens at the end of this book. Reason number 10, this book is really at its core about how to be an independent chick. Above all, this is a depiction of Lucy Snowe just trying to get by and find a purpose for herself and a place for herself in a world that doesn't explicitly want her. So it's about a woman just putting one foot in front of the other and find some sort of meaning in her life. And it's particularly about a Victorian woman for whom the marriage plot does not apply and what she makes of her life in lieu of that. So those are my 10 10 reasons why I think you should read Villette by Charlotte Brontë. And honestly, there are so many other reasons that I don't even have time to mention here. This book has everything. It is so good. It is one of my favorites of all time, and I really wish more people read it because I think so many people would love it. That's all I have for you guys today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.